Monday morning. A man walks onto a train platform, just as he does every weekday. Same station, same commute, same crowd of strangers. He checks the time, looks down the tracks, and waits. Across the platform, there is a woman. He doesn't notice her, not really. She is simply another face in the crowd. Tuesday morning. Same platform, same commute. And somewhere across the tracks, the same woman is standing there again. He may not even consciously recognize her. Wednesday. She's there again. Friday. Again. The following Monday. Again. They never speak. They never make eye contact. He doesn't know her name. He doesn't know where she works. He knows absolutely nothing about her. Then one morning, something changes. He stops for coffee before work. The shop is crowded. People waiting, talking, moving past one another. And standing near the counter is the woman from the platform. And for just a moment, she feels different from everyone else in the room. Not like a friend, not even like an acquaintance, but somehow not quite like a stranger either. Nothing has happened between them. She has never been kind to him, never helped him, never given him any reason to trust her. In fact, she has never given him any reason to feel anything about her at all. Except, he has seen her before, again, and again, and again. And strangely, that may be enough. Because the human mind does something remarkable with familiarity. We encounter something once, and it is new. We encounter it again, and it becomes recognizable. Again, and it becomes familiar. And sometimes, without realizing it, familiarity begins to feel like preference. The song you didn't like until you'd heard it 10 times. The brand you've never purchased but somehow trust more than one you've never heard of. The face that becomes more appealing the more often you see it. Even the place that begins to feel comfortable simply because you've been there before. Nothing necessarily improved. Nothing necessarily became safer. Nothing necessarily became better. Only one thing changed. You had seen it before. And that raises an uncomfortable question. How many of the things you believe you chose did you actually choose because they were better? And how many simply became easier to choose because they were already familiar? This is the mere exposure effect. So, if familiarity can influence preference, the question isn't whether we recognize the things around us. It's what that recognition is quietly doing. Because every day we encounter the same faces, the same names, the same products, the same sounds, again and again. Most of those encounters seem meaningless. But what if they aren't? What if repetition is doing something beneath conscious judgment, making certain things feel easier, safer, even more appealing before we've decided what we think about them? To understand why, we need to ask a surprisingly simple question. Can merely seeing something before change how much we like it? For a long time, it seemed reasonable to assume that preference required information. We like something because we've learned something about it, because it rewarded us, because someone persuaded us, or because we've compared it with something else and decided it was better. But what if none of that is necessary? What if the mind can begin forming a preference without receiving any new information at all? By the 1960s, psychologist Robert Zajonc had become interested in precisely this possibility. He suspected that simply encountering something repeatedly might be enough to change how we feel about it. Not because repetition teaches us that the thing is good, but because something familiar is processed differently from something new. It was a deceptively simple idea, and testing it required surprisingly little. No elaborate persuasion, no rewards, no argument. Just unfamiliar things shown to people more than once. If Zajonc was right, then preference didn't always have to begin with a reason. Sometimes it might begin with repetition. Zajonc's idea was simple. Show people something unfamiliar more than once and see whether repetition changes how they feel about it. In a series of experiments, participants were exposed to unfamiliar stimuli. Sometimes they were meaningless words, sometimes strange symbols, sometimes images they had no reason to prefer over any other. Some appeared only once, others appeared several times, and some appeared again and again. Later, participants were asked which ones they liked more. The result was remarkably consistent. The more often people had encountered something, the more positively they tended to evaluate it. Nothing about the stimulus had improved. It hadn't become more useful, more beautiful, more rewarding. Participants hadn't been told that one was better than another. They had simply seen some of them more often, and that alone was enough to shift preference. This mattered because it challenged a very comfortable idea that liking begins with judgment, that first we evaluate, then we decide, then we feel. Zajonc's work suggested that sometimes the order may be different. Sometimes feeling begins before explanation. We encounter something, it becomes familiar, and only afterward the conscious mind may begin constructing reasons for why it seems appealing. In other words, we may not always like something because we've decided it is good. Sometimes we may begin deciding it is good because we already like how familiar it feels. So why should repetition create preference? Why would the mind treat familiarity as something positive? One explanation begins with something psychologists call processing fluency. When we encounter something new, the brain has work to do. It has to identify it, interpret it, determine whether it matters, and decide whether it might represent opportunity or danger. Novelty carries uncertainty. But the second time we encounter something, the work becomes slightly easier. The pattern is no longer completely new. Recognition begins. The brain processes it more fluently, and that ease can feel good. Not dramatically, not consciously, but subtly enough to influence judgment. The familiar object may feel easier to understand. The familiar face may feel less uncertain. The familiar song may feel more predictable. And because the experience itself has become smoother, we can mistake that smoothness for something about the object. We may think, this is better, this feels right, I like this one. When part of what we're actually experiencing is simply ease. And there is another reason familiarity can matter. For much of human history, something encountered repeatedly without causing harm was often something that had already proven itself safe enough to survive. A familiar path, a familiar face, a familiar sound. The unknown demanded attention. The known often demanded less. That doesn't mean familiarity is always good. Repeated exposure can sometimes produce boredom or even irritation, especially when something is unpleasant to begin with. But under many ordinary conditions, familiarity reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty can quietly become preference. Which means the effect isn't really about repetition alone. It's about what repetition does to the experience of uncertainty. The world feels a little easier when we've seen it before. Once you recognize the mere exposure effect, you begin seeing it everywhere. Advertising depends on it. A brand doesn't always need to persuade you the first time you see it. Sometimes it simply needs to be there. On a screen, on a shelf, on a sign you pass every morning. Then one day, when you're choosing between something familiar and something you've never seen before, familiarity may already have placed a finger on the scale. And it isn't only products. We encounter people this way too. A coworker we pass in the hallway, a neighbor we see across the street, a face that keeps appearing in the same cafe. Repeated contact doesn't guarantee friendship or attraction, but under the right conditions, a stranger can gradually begin to feel less strange. And perhaps that's what makes the effect so difficult to notice. Nothing announces itself. There is no moment when familiarity says, "Now you like me." It simply accumulates, quietly, until what was once unfamiliar begins to feel like it belongs. But there is an important distinction. Familiarity can influence preference. It cannot tell us whether something deserves it. A familiar idea isn't necessarily true. A familiar product isn't necessarily better. And a familiar person isn't necessarily more trustworthy. So when something simply feels right, there is a useful question to ask. Do I prefer this because I've considered it, or because I've encountered it before? Sometimes the answer won't change our choice, but recognizing the influence returns part of that choice to us. Think again about the woman on the train platform. Nothing about her changed. She didn't become kinder, safer, more interesting, or more deserving of attention. The only thing that changed was that she stopped being entirely new. And somewhere between the first morning and all the mornings that followed, familiarity began doing what familiarity does. It made the unknown feel known. We like to believe our preferences reveal something about the world. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they reveal something much simpler. We've been here before. We've heard this before. We've seen this before. And sometimes that is enough.